The jungle, with its dense canopy and thick undergrowth, was more than just a living, breathing organism. It was a kingdom untamed and relentless, where every branch seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Beneath the towering trees and among the venomous creatures, one could almost feel the weight of its history, a history written in the blood of those who dared to enter. And today the jungle would claim another soul. Liam's boots sank into the moist earth with each step. Sweat streamed down his face, dripping from his brow as he pushed through the dense foliage. The dense humid air felt like a vice around his chest, each breath harder than the last. His mission seemed simple enough on paper. A reconnaissance job to gather data on the jungle's ecosystem, a mission that didn't call for anything more than basic survival skills. But this was something else. The ground beneath him had started to shift, the earth softening with each hour that passed. The constant rustling, the unnerving silence between distant animal calls, something was off. He had been in the jungle for 3 days, yet it still felt like he was walking into the unknown, as though the land itself were resisting his presence. Every sound seemed to be amplified, every rustling leaf a threat, every shadow a potential predator. And then there was the feeling that had crept into his gut ever since he had set foot here, the undeniable sense that someone, or something, was watching him. Liam shook his head. He was a scout, a soldier. He had faced worse. His training had prepared him for hostile territories, environments far more brutal than this. But the thing that gnawed at him wasn't fear of the jungle, it was the unsettling feeling that for the first time he wasn't the predator in this ecosystem. He was the prey. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, checking the high-tech sensor strapped to his wrist. The display flickered, showing nothing but a static field. He frowned. It should have detected any unusual movement. But this jungle, this planet, had an intelligence of its own, something that bent the rules of his training in tech. Liam stopped in his tracks, squatting low, scanning his surroundings. The trees around him stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled limbs weaving in a complicated dance. He could hear the soft murmur of a distant river somewhere to the west, the occasional screech of a bird in the sky, but the underbrush, the life at his feet, remained still. Too still. A flash of movement. Just a blur at the edge of his vision. Liam's heart skipped a beat. His pulse quickened. His instincts, honed through years of combat, flared up. His hand instinctively went to the blaster holstered at his side, fingers brushing against the cool metal. He pulled it free, fingers tightening around the grip. Nothing. The underbrush was still. The jungle's noises had returned to their normal cadence. No signs of an animal, no indication of what he had seen. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, a result of days of isolation in an alien environment. But Liam knew better than to ignore his gut. Something was watching him. A slight rustle. Then another. Like footsteps. Liam froze, barely breathing. His fingers tightened around the blaster. He crouched lower, his eyes scanning the space around him. He had no choice but to wait. Whatever this was, it was out there, and it wasn't making its move yet. The longer it waited, the more certain he was that it wasn't an animal. This was something smarter. Something hunting him. For 3 days he had been walking deeper into this jungle, gathering data, taking samples, mapping the terrain. But now he realized he had made a fatal mistake. His mission was no longer about data collection. It was about survival. Crack. The snap. It came from behind him. Liam whirled around, his blaster raised, his breath catching in his throat. But there was nothing. Just the jungle. He was alone, or so it seemed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His training told him to move, to flee, to get the high ground. But something about this place, the stillness, the silence, felt like it was closing in on him. The mission was simple. But this wasn't. This was no longer a recon job. This was a game of cat and mouse, and he was the mouse. He took a cautious step forward, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. His fingers traced the edge of the blaster again. He felt the weight of it, comforting yet almost too light for the dread that had begun to fill him. Something was out there, something that knew the jungle better than he did. And he had no idea how far it would go to claim him. His mind raced, flashing back to the intel he'd been given before embarking on this mission. No mention of predators in the area. No mention of intelligent life, only native wildlife and potential hazards like the local flora. But there had been something else. A note in the briefing, disguised as a side comment easily dismissed, about unusual disturbances. Data that didn't fit into the established patterns. Liam cursed under his breath. He should have paid attention to the warnings. He should have known that a planet untouched by human hands might harbor secrets far darker than any briefing had suggested. And then, in the heavy silence of the jungle, a voice, a whisper, slipped into his mind. "I see you." His blood ran cold. Liam's head snapped around. His hand tightened on the blaster as he scanned the trees, the brush, the sky. There was no one. But the voice echoed in his head, clear as day. It wasn't a sound. It was something deeper. A thought, a presence. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, his instincts screamed at him to run. But the jungle had already begun its hunt. Liam had never believed in the supernatural, never thought that any predator could outmatch his experience. He had always been the one to control the situation, to outwit and outlast any challenge that came his way. But that was before he heard the voice in his mind, before he felt the jungle close in around him like a vice. Now everything was different. He moved swiftly through the underbrush, his every step measured, his senses on high alert. The jungle seemed to pulse with life around him. Creaking trees, chittering insects, the distant growl of a beast somewhere in the thick darkness. But it was the silence between those noises that unnerved him most. The silence that seemed to scream at him, urging him to run, to hide, to fight. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The jungle stood still, deceptively calm, as if it were watching him, waiting for the next move. For a moment, Liam allowed himself to breathe, to calm his racing pulse. Get a grip, he told himself. You've been in worse situations than this. You can handle this. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't like anything he had faced before. There was something intelligent in these woods, something that was hunting him. The question was who, or what, was the hunter? He pressed on, knowing that whatever was out there was getting closer. His eyes scanned the terrain for any sign of movement, any indication of danger. He checked his wrist sensor again, static. Still no sign of any anomaly. The jungle had swallowed his signal. For a moment he cursed the lack of communication, the isolation, but then he remembered, that was part of the mission. No contact. No help. Just him and the jungle. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the weight of the atmosphere press against him. The trees grew taller, their leaves twisting together in a canopy that blocked out the sun. It was a world of shadows, and in the shadows something was waiting. Liam stopped again, crouching low, listening. The air was thick, humid. His breaths were shallow, sweat dripping down his face. Every noise seemed amplified, every gust of wind a whisper of something watching him from just beyond his sight. He adjusted the strap on his blaster, his fingers brushing the weapon for comfort. He wasn't sure what kind of threat he was dealing with yet, but he knew this much: it was intelligent. More than that, it was patient. A flicker of movement, a rustle of leaves. He whipped his head toward the sound, raising his blaster, but again nothing. The space before him was empty, a maze of green and brown. Just the wind. Just the jungle, he told himself. But the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. He couldn't shake the sense that something, someone, was always one step behind him. Always just out of sight, moving silently, anticipating his every move. He picked up the pace, moving faster now, his footfalls silent against the earth. He needed to get out of the open. He needed to find a way to defend himself. But the dense jungle was like a labyrinth, every path leading deeper into its heart. The trees twisted and turned, creating walls of green that seemed to close in on him. He reached for the compass at his belt, glancing at the glowing display. His coordinates were as he expected, but the path ahead seemed to spiral into the unknown. No choice but to keep going, he thought. But even as he made his decision, the sound of something snapping twigs in the distance caught his attention. Liam froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like a footstep heavy enough to leave an impression. Someone, something, was following him. He spun around, his weapon raised, scanning the trees in every direction. The jungle was alive with sounds, but none of them gave him the clarity he needed. The deep rumble of distant animals, the rustle of branches in the breeze, these were the noises of an environment that had no room for weakness. Suddenly he heard a sound that didn't belong, breathing. Deep, measured breaths, too rhythmic to be the wind. Too precise. It was the sound of a predator stalking its prey. Liam's heart hammered in his chest. He moved again, faster this time, darting toward a thick cluster of ferns and tall grass. The undergrowth was dense here, and the tangled vines provided the perfect cover. But as he ducked into the brush, a strange realization dawned on him. The jungle was closing in on him, yes, but it wasn't just the environment. It was the creature. The predator had been tracking him, not just by his physical movements but by his mind too. That whisper, that voice. It had known exactly when he had been vulnerable. It had known where he would go next. And it was getting closer. Liam pushed through the thick undergrowth, his muscles aching with the strain, his breath coming in short, harsh gasps. He had to get to higher ground. There was a ridge not far off, a vantage point. If he could just make it there, he'd have the upper hand. But even as the thought formed in his mind, he knew it wasn't that simple. The creature knew what he was thinking too. He stumbled as he ran, his foot catching on a root, but he quickly regained his balance. His blaster was ready, his pulse steadying despite the terror clawing at him. He couldn't let fear take hold. He couldn't let his guard down. Another sound closer now. A low, guttural growl, barely audible but unmistakable. The Huntress was closing in. Liam's eyes darted around for any sign of movement. There. A flash of something, too quick, too dark to be an animal. It moved across his path, weaving through the trees with unnatural speed. He cursed under his breath. It was her. He didn't need to see her face to know that the hunter in the jungle wasn't some wild animal. It was intelligent, calculated, and relentless. He could hear the brush parting behind him now, the rhythmic thud of footsteps as the huntress closed in. She was getting closer, and this time he knew she wouldn't miss. He didn't know who or what she was, but one thing was certain. This chase had only just begun, and he was no longer the predator. He was the prey. And in this jungle the rules were simple. There was no escape. Only the hunt. Liam's breath echoed in his ears as he crouched low beneath the thick canopy of leaves. The world had gone eerily still, the usual rustle of insects and the calls of birds muted, as if the jungle itself had held its breath. He could feel the weight of something unseen, something powerful, pressing down on him from every direction. It wasn't just a feeling, he knew she was there. Somewhere close. Watching. The huntress had stopped playing with him. She had ceased the cat-and-mouse game of taunting footsteps and hidden movements. She had become silent, too silent, like the jungle had absorbed her, and Liam was left with nothing but the relentless gnawing sense that she was moving, stalking, circling just beyond his sight. She's toying with me, he thought, frustration bubbling to the surface. But even as he thought the words, doubt gnawed at him. No predator he had ever faced had been this patient, this calculating, this intelligent. He strained his senses, listening intently for any hint of movement, any whisper of a leaf disturbed. But there was nothing. Just the pounding of his own heart in his chest. His fingers brushed the cool metal of his blaster again, reassuring himself that it was still there. The weapon was his only advantage, but it felt like a futile comfort in this strange, unnerving game. No gun had ever been able to fire quickly enough against a predator that could read his mind, his every move. The wind shifted, sending a faint rustle through the trees. He froze, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for the source of the disturbance. For a moment, he thought he saw something, an almost imperceptible movement in the distance, a flicker of dark fabric against the green backdrop. But when he blinked, it was gone. She's closer, Liam thought, fighting the rising panic clawing at his chest. He had to move. He had to break the silence before it swallowed him whole. He rose from his crouch and began walking, carefully, deliberately, as though every step might betray him to her. His legs ached from days of trekking through the dense jungle, and the humid air clung to his skin like a second layer, heavy and suffocating. But it wasn't the physical strain that gnawed at him now. It was the knowledge that at any moment, the Huntress could spring from the shadows. How long has she been following me? Liam thought, eyes scanning the terrain. Is she even human? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He had seen signs, strange tracks, prints in the mud that didn't belong to any creature he could identify, the eerie whispers on the wind that sounded too purposeful to be mere chance. His mind raced through the possibilities. A native hunter? An alien being? Whatever she was, it didn't matter. She was a predator and he was her prey. He paused beneath a thick tree, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. He touched his communicator, but the signal was still lost, buried under the dense jungle's interference. He felt cut off from the world, alone in a place where even the natural world seemed to work against him. His fingers trembled slightly as he reattached the device to his waist, cursing under his breath. In the silence that followed, Liam felt it again, an instinctive primal sense that something was behind him. He didn't dare turn around. Instead, he took a long, slow breath and shifted his weight ever so slightly, trying to stay aware of every subtle movement around him. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the trees closer. He could almost feel her eyes on him, though he couldn't see her. She was waiting just out of sight. She was always one step ahead, always just beyond his reach. Suddenly a twig snapped. It was faint, barely perceptible, but Liam's heart leapt into his throat. His gaze whipped around, scanning the area. The jungle was alive with movement now, the leaves trembling as if stirred by something unseen. But there was no sign of the Huntress. Damn it, he cursed inwardly. She's too good. It was as though she had become part of the jungle itself, blending into the environment, moving with the shadows and the wind. He had no idea where she could be, and that terrified him more than anything else. The feeling of being hunted, of being so close to something but never able to reach it, was suffocating. His mind was screaming at him to run, but he knew that if he did, she would be waiting. She would anticipate his every move just like she always had. The air grew colder and Liam felt a chill crawl down his spine, his body tense with dread. The jungle seemed to close in even tighter now, as though it were conspiring with the Huntress against him. He wasn't alone. A breath, slow and deliberate, drifted toward him on the wind. Liam's eyes widened as he whipped around, searching frantically, but again there was nothing. No movement, no rustle of leaves. Only the oppressive silence and the feeling that something, or someone, was just behind him. A sudden noise to his left. He spun, raising his blaster instinctively, but again there was nothing. His heart hammered in his chest. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Focus, Liam. Focus, he told himself, forcing his breathing to slow. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to be better than this. He had to outsmart her. And yet, as he stood there, his body trembling from the cold sweat and the fear gnawing at his bones, he knew deep down that the rules of the game had changed. She wasn't after a fight. She was after him. She was patient. She was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Every second he spent in this jungle made it harder to see her for what she truly was. She wasn't just a hunter. She was a force of nature, something untouchable, something that existed beyond his understanding. But in that moment, in the eerie silence that pressed in from all sides, Liam realized the worst part of all. The longer he stayed in this game, the more he began to think like her. The predator's mind was creeping into his own thoughts. And soon, very soon, he might forget who he was altogether. Am I becoming the prey? The thought almost crushed him as his mind floundered, desperately trying to break free from the jungle's clutches. He tried to remind himself of who he was, of what he had been trained for. But there was no room for escape. Only the stalk. And in that silence, with every heartbeat counting the seconds until she struck, Liam knew one thing for certain. He was no longer in control. The Huntress had become the hunter of his own mind.